Hi, everybody. This is Tara Bradley with the Growth State, and I'm really excited to have my good friend Dusty Schroeder with us today. He is, in my opinion, a marketing genius. He has done things that I've been so impressed with, and all in scaling businesses. I've seen him a few times over almost build his own little ad agency on no budget, tons of vision. His expertise is in brand identity, market placement. Um, he's fantastic at sales enablement. Probably doesn't want me to tell you that because it's not his favorite thing. But I think he brings a really, really unique perspective to what we're all going through, which is trying to scale a business. And we are in that weird, delicate balance. We're trying to figure out how much do you spend on marketing? What's the ROI on that spend? How do you measure it? How do you know you're getting what you want out of your marketing dollars? And Dusty has come up to speed so fast in that area and can get companies going and get huge results. Fill the pipe. And that's the name of the game, right? You want your pipe full so that you can go out and execute on that. So Dusty, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, no, now I feel uncomfortable. A compliment, I don't, I don't do that well. My love language, growing up, our family, we just kind of ribbed each other constantly, and that's how we show love. And so, any sort of compliments is like, no, that's wrong, imposter
Yeah,
syndrome
I'm
runs
not
deep.
worried.
So, but
Yeah,
thank you. That's
you're
awesome.
welcome. Welcome. So I start all of my interviews the same way. You guys will notice that Dusty looks like he's 12. He's 14. So this is going to be an interesting question for him. And so I start all my interviews the same way. And, those of us that are going out and helping people and putting out content, the things that you do independently, they want to help people. And it's because they've experienced something that makes them want to shift and pivot and start to do something differently that other people aren't doing. And it's usually because of a pain point, right? It's like, hey, I've learned from this. I had this pain, I solved it, and I can take that forward and do that for somebody else. What was that pain point for you?
The pain point in what context? I think I maybe missed it.
Yeah. So if you think about, you've made this shift where you've gone into leadership and you've gone even a step beyond where you're coaching and putting out content for others to learn from maybe mistakes you've made or stuff that was painful in your life. What was there a defining moment where you're like, hey, I have some secret sauce here that I could really help other people with?
Yeah, I think it's just about being bold. And so I've always hated to give unsolicited advice, but I love having a conversation, and I'm an incredibly curious person where I ask questions over and over, just in stupid questions. I think they're stupid, and just because I'm always curious what people are going to say, because I'm constantly surprised by the response. And I listen to so much content, I absorb and read so much content that I think I mentioned it a little earlier already. You fight that imposter syndrome where you feel like no idea is your idea anymore, right? Because you feel like no idea is original. And so, like, what right do I have to share that? But at a certain point when you've done this enough and you say these things that almost seem obvious to you at this point, you realize they're not so obvious to everybody. And I think once you have that moment and you realize this thing could help someone, because it's helped you, I guess, at the end of the day, it's not, why not share that? And that's my approach when I help build a revenue engine for companies. And that's my approach individually, like just give it all away, right? Like give it all away and help people, and good things will happen.
Yeah, I love that. And I think you bring up a really good point that people forget about content and putting, your stuff out there. It's rarely to say, hey, I'm the smartest guy on the block and you should do what I say and here's the way to do it. It really is, the intention is to start a conversation, right? And so you can have a dialogue and that we can learn from each other. So I love that you bring that perspective. So tell us a little bit about the journey of, you've been in a super early startup, in junior high, and you did everything, right? You did sales, you got into marketing, you built out teams, and like I said, on a shoestring budget. And so many of the people watching today are at that spot, right? They're like, hey, we have something that we can sell and people want, it solves a problem. how do we get it in people's hands, and how do we get people knowing about it? If they're just really starting to build that marketing engine and funnel and pipe to get their clients or ideal clients lined up, what's the first step? I mean, what do you look at first?
Well, oh, man, one thing. I don't know if there's one thing. I think you need to stop mentioning that I can do this stuff on no budget, because I think the next company I work for, if I work for another company, I'm never going to get any budget if they ever see this. Um, so yeah, no, it's really, I mean, again, to me, it feels simple, but it's about focus, right? It's first going, okay, where's the revenue going to come from, and what are we actually selling? And let's focus on that. Where I've seen it over and over again for the company I work full time for, and the companies I consult with. They want to do so many things, rightfully so, because you have really entrepreneur type people that they want to solve so many problems, and that's great. But let's start with one, and let's create that focus. And depending on what your annual revenue size is and things like that, that might change your strategy. Depending on the stage of your company, that might change your approach. But a huge thing right now, and this does work, is again, creating content, but content in the form of a contribution, right? So how are you going to contribute to your market before they're even a client? And so I almost think of marketing as pre-client success, right? And so you have client success once they're a customer, and you want to make them successful using your product. Well, how are you going to make them successful before they're even using your product? If you can do that, if you can give them ways to be successful, guess where they're going to come to when they want to grow even more? They're going to come to you. They're going to find your solutions. And so it's not that simple, but if you can be really good at this, podcasts right now, and I'm a huge fan of podcasts, I'm a little bit biased, but if you can create a podcast, and I'm not the first person to preach this at all, you can accomplish so much as far as awareness, but you're also getting client research if you're doing that. If your podcast is like interviewing clients or potential clients, and you're also potentially building a pipe off of that, because usually if you have someone on your podcast, they might be more willing to talk to you about your solutions and what you provide to the market as well. And so you get market research, you get pipe growth, and you get these connections that will hopefully grow and compound over time as well. And that's probably too specific, because there's so many things you can look at depending on the phase of the company, what they're good or bad at. But those are some of the places where I start thinking about when I enter a company.
So many good things there. So I'm going to ask you a few questions that it may see a little disjointed as we get through them, but you said a lot there, and I want to make sure that we hit on a few key points. The first one was, that I loved what you said about, having the focus and knowing what your market is, and, knowing what you're selling, right? Because if you're really diluted in your offering and you don't have great success with one, it's really hard to build a brand around that, right? It's hard to get brand identity, because they're like, well, what do they do exactly? Is it this? Is it this? What are they great at? And have you experienced that, where you've actually had to go into a product marketing group or work with a product management group and say, hey, this is all great, but what's the horse we're going to ride today? What's the thing that's going to get us across the finish line?
Yeah, I think, and most of the companies I've worked with or for, it's usually the case. And almost no product stack is as simple as I would like it to be, even after I've been at a company for a few years, right? I feel like it could always be simpler, because the focus is always on the buyer. And if you focus that way, usually if you look at a product stack, even the internal team is confused. And if that's the case, how do you think your buyers are that's spending 60 seconds on your websites, or 2 minutes on your website? And so if you can pull that back, and it's really not that difficult, because usually you have some revenue and you go, okay, where's the revenue coming from? All right, that's the horse we're going to ride until we got that nailed down.
Yeah.
And once we have that nailed down, we can add another horse over here. But for now, let's ride this thing. And yeah, like you said, with brand identity, you need to know that before you can make a stand in the market. And you have to have something to say. You can't just have a solution. You can't just solve a problem. I mean, you can, but you have to tell why that's different. And again, these are not my ideas, but not better, but different. What is different about this? What is different about this new way of doing things that you are providing to the market, that you're contributing? not better. Like, hey, we're not going to make you 10% better at this. Like, no, this is a new way of thinking.
Mhm.
And that's so much about positioning and how you talk to the market more than even the product itself.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I think it ties into another point that you brought up, and it's a consistent point, is that thought leadership is really important whenever you're going into a space, because you do want to have that different way that gets people thinking, gets them engaged, and like you said, you're contributing to the industry, but with the intent of creating engagement. It's not even really the intent of, oh, we got to get a sale and that's what it's about. It's like, hey, we're going to put out good information. We're going to, really advocate that we're the experts and this is why it's so important. And then we want to have conversations about it and build a fan base before there may be even a client.
It's so true. If you the more it's counterintuitive, but the more you can separate the content, the thought leadership that you put out in the market from the goal of creating business, the better that content will be, and the more successful will be in creating business. So the more you can say, like, I just want to create, like, if I were looking for this, if I needed this, if I were a biller in a hospital, what is something that, man, I could print out and put next to me and it would help me out. I could look at it every day and I could find, and that would be resourceful for me, right? Like, if you can get in the mind of your customers and go, like, it really is a contribution to making their day easier. If you can create those things consistently and persistently and put it out there, that is when you're going to change the business. You don't need to say, hey, and if you want more help with that, you know who to reach out to. You don't need to say that, right? People are smart now. People have been on the internet for 20 years now. They know what the next step to take if they want to take it.
Yeah. And I think of this as a really, really important point, no matter where you're at in your journey, right? Like in scale, if you're, still a startup and you're like, oh, what am I doing? Get out in the market, get your name out there, have conversations with people. If you're a 15-year company and you're, maybe you're still growing, or you just did something new to hit scale, you got a new market, and you haven't, you're old school, you don't really believe in the whole social, you don't have a strong platform there, you got to get in the game, because that's how people are engaging, especially right now. And so I think that's such a great point. Dusty, one of the things, and you had said something else about the shoestring budget, which Dusty and I have done a few deals together, and every time we go to the table to do a deal, they're like, that's all you're spending on marketing? We got to give them more money. We finally learned, I think, where we came in and our last one, we're like, we said that when we got to the new company, we're like, you got to put more money into marketing. Like, you have to invest there now so we don't look silly later. But why do you think that is? Why do you think people are scared to market in this scaling phase, or when they're trying to build traction, momentum, and they kind of have this mystery that the clients will come, and they're afraid to put money in where they don't have a guaranteed ROI? How do you address that when you're talking to a business leader, either through consulting or a new engagement, where you're like, hey, this is, trust me, this money is gonna pay dividends? How do you walk them through that conversation?
Yeah, it's hard, but depending on the person's mentality on that, and they have so many other things going on, right? And so many people think you build a better product, you build a better mousetrap, better solution, that people will just come. There's so much belief in that. And once in a while that happens, but most of the time it does not. Honestly, the best way to do it is to have stories, and to, at least in my experience, to have stories and just have that conversation about, think about yourself. How do you buy? When's the last time you bought a solution for your business, for yourself, for your family, anything else? Do you, when you go to look for a CRM for your business, or a ticketing system, or a support system, what do? What are all the steps you take? And more people are going to other businesses in back-end forums, and they're texting their buddy from 4 years ago because they work somewhere else. Hey, what do you use, right? And so much of today, people put an emphasis on, like, Google search and things like that, and you need to be there. But it's everything else leading up to that, because you don't search for something, you don't search for a brand or something else until you've already gotten that referral. You've already seen their content 10 different times. You ever seen the brand? And so I think once you tell enough stories, you can walk them through a journey of their own experience in buying a solution. Almost every time they're like, oh yeah, you know what? You're right. I'm not buying an enterprise B2B solution by just Googling, hey, what are the best? I mean, you may be at some point, but you're really asking for referrals and content, looking for who are the best people in the market that are consistently providing and contributing to the market in this way and look like they know what they're doing. And it's not through Google. That's
Right.
through all these other channels and consistently put it out there. And it kind of goes back to, I'll put some more thoughts to your earlier question about if you're a startup, um, if you can't get a podcast going of like interviewing people and different things, if you're really early, the best thing you can do from my perspective is tell your story publicly. Like, hey, this week, look at the progress we're making. Like, hey man, we're working on this feature, working on this product. Like, it's been a tough week. And you just authentically contribute to the market and go, hey, this is what we're building toward. We're so excited to get this to the market. If you can tell the story of building your business and building your solution, you'll be surprised at what kind of traction you can build to if you're really early doing that.
Yeah. And I think the important point there is people start to do that and they don't get that engagement and they don't, they're like, oh, people are watching it, but they're not following or they're not liking, but they're being heard, right? Like
Yep.
don't stop because you're not seeing a ton of interaction. They're hearing it, they'll remember, and it's definitely time well spent.
You'll be surprised. And it's like investing, right? At first you're like, I'm not going any, like my trade volume is not doing anything, but compound interest is real and it's something our brains can't really gather intuitively. But that compounding effect happens in other ways of life too, not just in money. It happens with that social interaction. And so if you can be, I always say consistent and persistent. You already heard me say it once. If you can be consistent and persistent with your message, it will build over time. I mean, it has to resonate, it has to be the right message, but once you figure that out, you have to be consistent, persistent, because yes, more people are seeing those things and talking in their living rooms now, not the office. They're talking to each other about those things. I guarantee you, if it resonates.
Yeah, definitely. Talk to us a little bit about marketing metrics, right? So we're always trying to figure out, for this dollar spend, what did it translate into in sales? And sometimes we feel they're important. What's your CAC score? There's all of these things that we can track. What do you find is the most beneficial when you're scaling?
Yeah, and those are important. And I think we're at the beginning of entering in a new phase of like revenue metrics where the last 5 years or so, everything has become like data. Like, let's put the scientist at the head of the marketing role, completely put them in there. And I was on that train. We worked for a company, right, that had some great PE backers, and they taught us a ton. And I learned a ton from that. And we had every metric you could ever want. At the end of the day, though, it becomes revenue, right? So what I want to track at the end of the day, my leading metric is how much real revenue opportunity do we have in the pipe? And from there, how much do we close it, right? And so there are a lot of leading metrics that get you there, but we have to get rid of these vanity metrics that just distract us from the goal and distract us from doing things that aren't really having an impact. Like all the stuff we've talked about right now, like through this call, are so many of those things. Unfortunately, you can't attribute them. Like you can't say, hey, that piece of content led to that referral call with that person down the road. Like you just can't do it. The buyer journey is not a straight line anymore.
Mm-hmm.
The buyer journey is like, it's just all over the place. It's a mess. Yeah. And that's why you have to be consistent and persistent. I'll say it again, I'm being consistent with it. But what early on, the metrics that lead to revenue that I'll follow is like, what are your branded terms, search terms going up? And so not just like your effectiveness of conversion, but like, are people searching for your brand more often? So your brand name, right? Like you need to protect it on search, but if that is going up, if they're searching for your brand name and brand terms, that means your exposure and your brand identity is starting to resonate in the market. Same thing with direct hits to your homepage. So if more people are landing on your homepage without even going to search, they're just going right to your URL without even having to search. If that's increasing, again, that's probably a good leading indicator to show that your brand awareness is increasing over time. And I'm talking mostly in the B2B enterprise space here. But I really like, maybe because I'm a brand guy first, but I really like to look at those type of leading metrics that are showing me that my brand awareness and identity is having an impact in the market, and people are starting to resonate and kind of be curious about what's going on there.
Yeah, I think that's great. And we come back to the brand, and we've talked about brand identity previously. And I know that you've done some rebranding, and in some companies a couple times in a fairly short window. And people get really freaked out about that. Well, like, where are we getting brand recognition? And they know us, and then you're rebranding. And I think the difference is it's the way you rebrand, right? And what the intent is, and you're trying to get different outcomes. And a lot of people that are watching this are probably in that space and don't know it. How do you know that you have to tweak your brand, that you're what you're putting your efforts into it needs an adjustment, so that you're seen and received better in the market.
Yeah, because you shouldn't always do it. It's the easiest thing. It's the easiest thing to do as a marketing leader, to come in and say, let's do a rebrand and show some impact. It's not that easy to do well, but it's the easiest thing to say, like, look at all the change we made, right? And so, and yes, I have done that a few times, but I've done it for reasons I think were meaningful for those companies. One thing is to get that message down. Like, it's not just the visual identity, it's showing, okay, what are we going to say in the market? What is our different? What is the stand we're going to make the market say? And this is the old way, we're the new way, and here's why, right? Who's coming along with us? So you need to identify that, and then you need the visual identity to reflect that. And so if you're saying you're the new way, but your visual brand reflects something from a different era, that's not going to match up. It's not going to sync up. So you need to sync those things up. You got to be careful, right? You don't want to lose that brand identity that might be out there. But yeah, you need to sync up so your visual identity matches with the message that you're going to bring to the market. That's one. And the other thing would be, if you look at your industry and your vertical, oftentimes you're going to blend, you're going to camouflage.
Mm-hmm.
So get your 2, 3, 5 biggest competitors and just put those like top to bottom, like logo colors. Look at those. So if you see those, oftentimes the industry, they revolve around like a 2 to 3 color palette, right? Blues, greens, whatever. And so how are you going to, if people are scrolling through stuff, how can you quickly identify in their mind that you are the different in the industry space, right? And so color identity, what you're saying, visual identity, what that logo looks like. Is it complex? Is it simple? All those things play into a bunch of nuanced choices of who you want to be in the market. Sorry, I'm probably rambling a little bit.
No, I think it's perfect. And so for those of you listening, this is one place where I've seen Dusty go in and do rebranding, and it's been incredibly successful. And it's for those companies that were in startup for an extended period of time, right? Like, it took them longer to figure out what is my niche and what makes sense. And so they branded a little too early, and then they've evolved and gotten really focused on their niche, and they haven't synced up their brand. And so a lot of times I've seen Dusty come in and say, you branded as a startup, but you're scaling now, and we've got to be different. We've got to do that thing. And so I think that's a really good point. One of the things that I know that we talk about often when we get into these, and I think it comes back to that clarity, is naming your offerings, which you and I have had 1,000 conversations about. I'm going to tell you a quick story about Dusty. One time in one of the companies he worked in, he had this idea, and it's probably, like he said, not his idea. It was probably in the industry at a time that, like, these programs, all of the offerings under these programs should have similar names. And so I don't even remember what we were working on, but he's like, we're thinking about Fuego and Fiesta. I was like, this sounds like a bad car company branding. Like, I don't know if I'm on board with this, but everybody struggles with trying to figure out what to name their offering, and they rename it 100 times, which then puts, all of these weird contracts out there. How do you sift through the noise of that?
Yeah, naming is really tough. I think, like most things, I would say my approach would be like, how simple and obvious can you make it? So does that name really reflect what that thing is going to do for the person on the other end. That's usually the best bet. But naming is all over the board. Again, I think it's more about being consistent and understanding what that hierarchy is, because naming, that's going to impact, and it's kind of a chicken and egg conversation here, but first thing to figure out, okay, what is your product stack, right? Do you have like 3 different top level products, or do you have one product with a bunch of different features underneath? So before you can even start naming your stuff, you need to figure out what your product stack look like. Like how do you want to tier that or not? And once you figure that out, then it's more about, at least my perspective, does it represent what it's going to do for the person, and can it play off your brand at all? If you can hit those 2 things, you're doing pretty well. But at the same time, Steve Jobs, he named Apple. You know why he named Apple? At least this is a story. I think it's true. So he named Apple, I believe, because it comes before Atari in the phone book. So he just wanted to be ahead in the listing of these other companies. And I don't know if that's true or not. And so there was no other reason than that. So sometimes we can overthink these things too, and we're not all going to be Apple. No, probably none of us are going to be Apple actually. Right. Yeah, I mean, naming, I'm actually doing a naming exercise right now for a different company, some things. And so it's a lot of art and science combined, and a lot of thesaurus webbing. So.
Awesome. Well, we're about out of time. I want to ask you one last question, because I think it's really relevant to the group that's watching. You know, they're scaling, and they are looking to really invest in marketing more than likely, and could be looking for their very first marketing leader. And they're probably struggling with what do I need versus what can I afford, depending on what niche they're in. How do you recommend that they go through that vetting process, and what's really important to look at in this stage of scale?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it matters what type of company you are, what your goals are, things like that. And even more so, it matters what kind of CEOs/founders that you have attached to that. Because if you have really engaging founders/CEOs that are willing to be in the market, you need someone that can really help distribute and push that person to produce the right type of content, right? But depending on your revenue and your funding status and things like that, you may be better off hiring one jack of all trades that can work with agencies, and you might have to use best of breeds. And other people have different philosophies here where they want to build everything in-house. And I think ideally over time, that works better. But early is probably finding those best of breeds, and somebody that's really smart and capable with all marketing across the board to be able to manage those agencies really well.
Awesome. Well, Dusty, thank you so much. I know we're right at time. For those of you watching, I had a teaser that Dusty's really, really good at sales enablement and sales operations, which he doesn't like to talk about because it's not his favorite thing. But I may twist his arm and see if he might come back and talk to us about that, because I think it's a big deal at this phase. And the reason Dusty's like to talk about it is because he's good at it. He's always pushes it forward in any company he goes to, but he doesn't want to own it. He wants someone else to own it.
It's all connected, right? It's all connected.
Yeah, it's all connected. But he, I think, has some really good tips. So we may see if we can bring him back. But thank you so much, Dusty. I appreciate your time, and we will chat again soon.
Thanks, Tara. Love catching up with you.